Um, and yeah, super grateful that you all are coming here to learn alongside us today. My name is Alex Edgar, and I was Edgar Foundation Ambassador at UC Berkeley for the last 2 years. Just recently graduated. When I miss working with the wonderful team. And I'm here alongside my wonderful co-presenter. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm gonna do that. Hey, Alex, and hello, Caroline. What a great opportunity to just, shine some light on you. You've been an extraordinary partner. Yeah, so I'm Sandra Bass. I'm the Associate Dean of Students and Executive Director of the Public Service Center here at UC Berkeley. And I've been in this role for, it'll be 10 years in January. It goes by fast. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here for a number of reasons, if you don't mind me taking a moment.
Mhm.
I've had an opportunity and an honor to meet and study with many of the veterans of the civil rights movement, and some of whom were part of Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964. So that's been extraordinary. And then I also found out about 2 years ago or 3 years ago that I have ancestry reaching back to Neshoba County, Mississippi. And so I went and visited. And that was just a really moving experience. So it's such a great honor to be here because what these folks did has been such a part of my life. So thank you.
Awesome. And with that, we are going to start our presentation on cultivating civic responsibility and joy in higher education. Um, just agenda, we're going to kind of like go through a bunch of different topics. Super excited. And kind of the first thing that we're going to touch on is youth empowerment and what that looks like. So Sandra, if you want to kind of introduce a bit of what UC Berkeley Public Service Center does and how y'all engage young people.
Yeah, thanks. So we've been around for a long time. We were actually started by students who had been involved in the civil rights movement. And again, some of whom had been to Mississippi during Freedom Summer. And when they came to Berkeley, they wanted to continue that work. So it took a little bit of time, but they actually formally established us in 1967. So we've been around about, 57 years? And really grounded in student agency. So we connect students, faculty, and communities to pursue social justice and transformative social change. And we do that through both curricular and co-curricular community service. And again, our model is really grounded in student agency. It's such a part of our organizational DNA. So in everything that we do, we are deeply collaborative with our student leaders.
And the students are so grateful for the Public Service Center. And I'm coming from the perspective as our ASUC, which is our student government vote coalition, which is student run, student funded, independent 501c3 student government. So different from a lot of campuses that might have, it's part of campus like administration. So we are an independent nonprofit that's in charge of running all of our student government services. And we really kind of are the main organizing body for all campus-wide civic engagement, education, messaging programs, pretty much everything related to civics and the election. We really serve as the hub for that and try to connect as many students as possible with that process. So just thought, kind of start off with some context of where we're coming from as we launch into this presentation. But the first thing I think, like when we're talking about the role of higher ed in civic engagement and education, is really about, as Sandra was saying before, like centering the students in the work that we're doing. So I think like the first kind of thing that comes to mind here is effective inclusion. So what does it mean as a higher education leader to keep your students at the center of everything you're doing? And I think the Public Service Center at UC Berkeley does such a great job of that in terms of being holistic, intentional, and sustainable. So that's really about making sure the voices of your students are included at every part of the process, that young people are being intentionally engaged in the process. So it's not just a stamp of approval, but really engagement in the actual kind of creation of it. And then one of the biggest things is the attitudinal and financial support to sustain their engagement. And really being able to provide advice, but also, when possible, making sure that the financial support is there for these students, as the work is incredibly difficult to do without the funding for programs, but also to respect the time and energy of our student organizers is incredibly important. And really, like, by providing that like legitimate like support and representation, it really enables your students and like young people in general to like feel like valued within the space, because it's really easy to tokenize young people for their kind of involvement within this type of work. Um, and I think like one thing that is so incredibly important when we're looking at like the higher education civic space, is making sure that we're really honoring every student's value, and like the lived experiences that they bring to the table. And there's a lot of kind of like different examples on this slide, but I think like very much trying to make sure that when students are engaging in the process, especially some of the higher level stuff that happen on campuses, whether it's about a campus-wide message, or a large scale program, making sure that these young people that you're working with are really a really strong part of the work that's being done. And I know that's something that very fortunate that Sandra, the Public Service Center, has been able to really encourage at UC Berkeley. And it has really made a world of difference in terms of how our students kind of engage with the work that we do. And the last thing kind of in this note that I think is worth mentioning is, the like implicit and explicit biases that often exist within higher education spaces, but also just, in our world overall, when it comes to, not seeing like the value of a student's perspective on the same level as, an administrator or a faculty member's perspective. And really like by, kind of providing that input, sometimes students will not like feel the desire to do it again if they don't see their voices actually being taken into account. So all I think very important as institutes of higher education to be responsible not just in like the work that they're doing, but in how they're engaging their students on campus. And then kind of want to take that thought into this idea of civic joy, which was kind of how I and a lot of my work have kind of taken this idea of like, how can we make our democracy something that is often scary, it's often stressful, and make it something that doesn't have to be such a downer. Like, how can we make our democracy part of our social lives? And I think especially within the higher education context, it's incredibly important, because as I'm sure if you're a student, you probably personally have felt, or if you're an educator or campus partner, that like so often like they're gonna students, we're gonna be going for the stuff for our majors or for our interests, but are unlikely to go out of our way to attend an event that doesn't connect with something we already care about. And I think like it really like kind of connects to this idea of like when our democracy, when our elections are something that that turns people off, it really makes it harder for students and just everyone. I'm sure a lot of us can relate to it, to want to engage with it. While on the other hand, the community spaces that our students and exist in already, whether that's based on an identity that they hold or a shared interest, those are often spaces that students do trust and they do turn to for support, in ways that they might not turn to, government or education institutions. And I think with that idea, like it's really about like turning into your campus context. And obviously every campus is different. To see like what type of events, what type of communities are your students actually going to, and how can you partner with existing programs to like really naturally have a voter registration table, to provide civic education materials that make sense for that community's context, and really the idea of building habit within existing habit, So that way, if maybe when they're, seeing these friends again, they're thinking about the election that's coming up, or they're thinking about, the connection that their community has to our democracy. Um, and like what that looks like in action, there's so many different ways, from the student perspective and from like the administrative perspective that you can really work on. On one hand, like it creates great opportunities for dialogue across differences, particularly when you're like going into community groups that might not traditionally, have been approached with civic engagement, and also like groups that may have been prevented from engaging in our democracy. That being able to connect this to something that's exciting and not seen as a chore, is definitely super helpful. And also like being able to make democracy seem more exciting is definitely one of the best tools we have against civic apathy. I mean, you can look at just like recently with Kamala Harris's rally in Atlanta and Megan Thee Stallion performing there. Like that to me is like a perfect example of like bringing something that a younger audience already has a connection with, and connecting it to something that could feel incredibly daunting, scary, stressful, and really trying to bridge that gap so it's a more natural connection, with a younger audience. Um, and yeah, with that, I wanted to hand it over to Sandra to talk a little bit about her experience the Public Service Center and how they really develop those communities of engagement.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I really appreciate all the love you're giving to the Public Service Center. And it's so shared. We just love working with the students. And I think it's a lot because of this notion of civic joy. I was so excited when you really centered that in your presentation, because it doesn't get nearly enough attention. Because even as we face all these really difficult challenges as a country and as a world, we can kind of get sucked into that and not recognize the importance of bringing joy into the work. And as you said, all the research shows that when you bring that sense of joy, it actually encourages participation and engagement. So it's just really critical. One of the things we do at the Public Service Center to try to intentionally cultivate and nourish joy is that we really see our center as a place of community and belonging for our students. And so then we ask ourselves the question, okay, what can we do to cultivate that for the students to feel like this is their home on campus? And so all kinds of little things that we do, if it's food, or sometimes we'll have even games, or, paint your own, Halloween costume. We did that one year. But any event, it's just things that seem maybe not directly related, but that are creating a sense of community and connection. And same, I would say, with if you're doing work with community partners, anyone on your campus, it's really important to connect to, yes, the struggles of the communities you work with, but also their joys. And it really creates a sense of civic purpose. And when students have that civic purpose, they're more likely to not only be engaged and vote while they're in university, but also beyond that. And so Alex just mentioned some wonderful ideas, lots of things happening on campuses, and just know that administrators are excited to do this work with you of cultivating community and joy.
Awesome. Love to hear it. And we're going to kind of share about one case study that was incredibly effective at UC Berkeley, which is a civic music festival that we call Votechella. And essentially, it was based around this idea that I've been talking about, which is like, how can we make civics fun? And we found that by hosting this annual event, which is essentially, we invite an artist to come perform on campus in our super public space, free for all students and community members to attend. And we have a bunch of speakers that come and talk about the importance of voter registration. We have a bunch of teammates that you see in the picture on the right, that are walking through the crowd and handing out flyers on how to register to vote, information about local elections, and really trying to support the process as best as possible to ensure that really every person that attends the event is not only getting the fun part of seeing someone like Smino or Walk a Flock of Flame or a lot of other cool artists that have come through over the years. And really just like, also getting the civic education and voter registration part of it. And we've just seen such incredible outcomes. The program started initially before the pandemic, but we were able to bring it back after we were back on campus, and I've just seen such a like kind of expectation and excitement for the event that like people will ask us if even if we're just tabling to register voters, people will be like when's Votechella happening this year? Like it's something that like students on campus are excited about. And it also is outside of our election day, like same day registration, which we have in California. It is our like largest single day of voter registration every time we host the event because it is such a community gathering spot that we're able to connect with so many students. And on this note, I kind of want to pass it over to Sandra to talk a bit about how, in her role, she's been able to support and really connect the work that the students are doing with the ecosystem of the campus administration.
Yeah, so as you can imagine, pulling off something like this is huge, and the students do all the work. I mean, they plan it, they execute it, and it requires a lot of different campus partners to come together to pull off events like this. So really my role here is like, how do I, make this happen for them a little bit easier, maybe like grease the bureaucratic wheels might be a way of putting it. And so a couple of things that we've done to try to think about these cross-campus collaborations is to create civic engagement groups that can bring folks together to help support these activities. So at the request of our student leaders, someone who was in Alex's role previously, actually, we established 2 civic engagement groups. And one of these groups is the Civic Engagement Committee, and these are like the campus worker bees. So we are the folks who are coming together that represent key offices on campus for events like this. And that could be like undergraduate and graduate student government, student organizations who are dedicated to nonpartisan voter education outreach. On the administrative side, residential life, student orientation, government and community relations, the registrar's office, and even the athletics department is enthusiastically participating. And in that group, what we do is really just strategize, plan, and then see how we can execute to support the students in their activities. And again, a lot of that is just making sure people are talking to each other, we're coordinating, and then eliminating some of those bureaucratic hurdles. And the other group that was also created at the request of student leaders was the Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs Civic Engagement Advisory Board. So this board is representatives from the executive suites of our university. And so that would include, the Vice Chancellor of Undergraduate Education, the Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs, the Associate Vice Chancellor of our residential housing space, those kinds of folks or their representatives. And the purpose of this board is to both inform them about what we're doing, right? So they know what kind of activities are on campus, but now you can also raise up to their attention any challenges that you're having so that they can then help, move the levers to make things happen. And part of, again, this was really the students that requested we create this body, but it was also bolstered, I should mention, by our state Secretary of State, who for many years have been working with higher education institutions in California to encourage student voting. And that all culminated in a bill that now requires that each campus have certain activities regarding voter education and voter outreach. And so between those two things, right, the students saying, we really want this, and the state saying, you need to do this, it really created the leverage we needed to create these bodies and to bring people to the table.
And it's been so helpful every step of the way. And then kind of like taking that note, right, of like, how can our campuses actually support, right? Like, how is that like civic responsibility that higher education institutions have? And like, what does that look like in action? So to kind of like, before we dive into that, I wanted to share a little bit of statistics collected from a lot of different reports that I think is just like important as we're doing this work to understand like what the reality of our unfortunately like low civic literacy rates means for the students that are in higher education. So according to recent studies that were done, 27% of Americans under 45 have a basic knowledge of US history. Only 44% of Gen Z says that public schools teach history accurately. Only 27% of Gen Z trust education officials to be politically neutral. 64% see false or misleading information online every week. And 16% of 18 to 29-year-olds are optimistic about the US system of education, right? So like that's kind of the framing of, as a Gen Z or myself, like that is like representative of a lot of what like, our generation has experienced, and the way that we interact with the world around us is very much based on, these perspectives on our education and governmental institutions. So it's really about like how do we support young people in feeling better about their government, about their education, about their country. And a lot of that is by having the institutions really show up for their students, particularly in higher education. Because as we've seen, like there's a lot of distance, and it's been so incredibly helpful working with Sandra, and as she was explaining the like advisory committees, like those help kind of decrease the distance between administration and students. And that's helpful because when they're both physically and metaphorically far away, like it becomes less clear for students and young people in general to like know how to connect with them. And that distrust in institutions really dilutes the enthusiasm. So if like a student who's never voted before, there's not a polling location like in sight, and they're like, I don't know, like I guess I just won't vote. I don't know where to go. And if they don't have someone who will point them in the right direction, it's really easy to kind of cut off enthusiasm before it really has the opportunity to blossom. Um, and also, as like we talked about before, like in these moments, oftentimes like students are turning to their communities, whether it's based on their identity, their nationality, their interests, for the kind of trusted messaging around everything, but also our elections. So how can we be in those places and work with those students to ensure that they really are able to feel as connected as possible? And that's exactly what I think, a lot of organizations have been doing. And, again, like the Public Service Center has played a huge part in kind of helping that at Berkeley, is that trust is a two-way street. And being able to financially and attitudinally invest in student-driven projects and encourage peer-based ideation and execution is so incredibly important. Because if students feel like they're being valued in the work that they're doing, and that the adults in the room see them as as an equal in the work, it is such a massive impact on their willingness to engage, and you'll bring their peers into engaging as well. And then also like looking for ways to implement solutions that tangibly improve access to civics. And there's a bunch of different ways that that looks like, and every campus has a different context in what can be done. But trying to figure out what are those ways to not just make a one-time program that works on civic education, but really is about a long-term change in how we interact with civics in higher education. And that idea, right, of action coupled with attitude is so incredibly important. And whether that's providing additional staff and faculty support, or kind of making the civic mission of our higher education institutions more than just words on paper, but actually actions, really does make a world of difference in terms of how our students engage with our democracy, but also higher education overall. And kind of the case study with this that has been a long working process at UC Berkeley was about campus polling location. So as it says there, UC Berkeley had a polling location crisis. What went so essentially, at UC Berkeley for the last 5+ years, at least as long as I've known about it, the polling location on campus was coordinated by our student government, by the Vote Coalition, and a good portion of funding to reserve the room on campus for the polling location was actually coming out of the budget for the Vote Coalition. And as I mentioned before, that as a independent 501(c)(3, like we primarily get our funds from a student fee and outside grants that we're able to pull together. So because of that, it was placing a large strain on our ability to host other programs and education events. Because this really is something that I think I and many others view as like one of higher education and our college campuses duties should be to provide a resource like the polling location to its students, was unfortunately largely turned back onto the students to be able to support their own access to voting. And often, in this process, we wouldn't be able to secure a location on campus until, very last minute, just because the process didn't often, involve the students until very late in the game when there wasn't a lot of availability. And really, this as like kind of the last note there says, like it often was like a responding out of crisis management of, how do we make sure that this happens, and can anyone get an extra $1,000 into the pot, versus really the idea of like it's our civic duty as a campus to provide a polling location. And very fortunately, after like over a year of Sandra and I working together on really pushing and talking with admin and local kind of community groups, we were able to get a commitment from the campus to secure a permanent polling location that will be used for elections going forward, that doesn't take any student student government fees to reserve for our use, and really is in such a central location that is super accessible to our students. And that location just so happens to be the Public Service Center. So I want to pass it over to Sandra to talk a bit more about the admin perspective on this whole, fun time we've had. And then also, what it's been like as the host of the polling location.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And you're right. It was like 5+ years, like every year I've ever been here. This was an issue. And I really appreciate you sharing this viewpoint, because I don't know to what extent, until you guys really articulated that the administrators understood how frustrating this was for students and how it really felt like, a huge imposition. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Just sharing that from the administrator's standpoint, the big issue for us, the campus, came down to space and cost. So Berkeley has been around for over 150 years. So we're the oldest campus in the UC system. And so we have very old buildings. And very few of them would serve well for a voting location, like the space wouldn't work or are accessible to students, or many of them are only available for rent, right? Because they're meant for events. So that's one issue, is just our infrastructure. The other thing to bear in mind is that we've increased our student population by 10,000 students in the last 10 years. And so there's a lot more students that need space, and that contributes to the space crunch as well. And then in regards to costs, for a number of reasons, so it could be uncertain state contributions, it's crises we've had like the pandemic, and we've had shutdowns for wildfires and brownouts and other financial challenges. So the campus never felt like they could dedicate money to rent out one of the few available spaces to be an AVL. And to give you a sense of the cost, the most accessible space on campus for rent would have been tens of thousands of dollars, right? Because they have to close it down for so many days before, so many days after, has to be open and secure for about 10 days, just really adds up. So then every year we would have these conversations, and Alex remembers, and we would come to the Civic Engagement Committee, and it would be like, okay, everybody, who can chip in money for a voting location? And at one point it's just like we all felt bad about it. And then it really felt bad when you realize that typically the largest contributors were the students. They put in the most money, and that just didn't seem right. So it was funny. We were concurrently here at the Public Service Center, as I mentioned, we really want to create a sense of community. And we had been thinking about, well, how do we create our space so that it's more accessible to students, more community friendly, more flexible? And so we had reconfigured our space where we took out all the cubicles, except for we had a few staff cubes off to one side and created this large community space. And we did that for a whole host of reasons. And we, got things so we could create small spaces when we needed them, but for the most part, it's a large open space. And it's funny, we came back from one of those meetings one day and I'm like, we should just have the voting center here. And I talked to my staff because just as a heads up, you don't throw that on a staff and not let them contribute. And I was like so proud of my staff. They were so enthusiastic. They were like, yes, we should be doing this. And so long story short, we now have an MOU with the campus where we will serve as a 4-day accessible voting location from Saturday through the Tuesday of the election. And my staff works virtually those days, which we are, have set up because of the pandemic. We know how to do that. So it's not even any challenges with our work schedules. And so it worked beautifully this first time. I wish I had taken pictures, but I don't have any pictures to share.
And that is how, working together, students and admin is really able to make like a tangible difference in what the campus like kind of feels like and culture wise around civics, because it as Sandra mentioned, like has been an issue for years upon years at Berkeley, and it was finally because we really were at the point of asking everyone like, let's find a solution. We need a solution, any solution we can find. That we finally were able to have this great new opportunity to really have the student body connect so much more with this place, then also serves as our polling location. And then I think like the last point we'll kind of talk about here before hopefully having some time for any questions y'all have is really about like the campus outreach. And as Sandra mentioned, like we had done a ton of work over the past couple of years to really work on bringing all the different partners from athletics to administration to student groups to the table, and it's really done a world of wonders in terms of our ability to really connect with our students. And one of those things that we've found really helpful is social media, and really like using trusted messaging to engage with our students on social media. So as like the top says, how to make social media not cringe. I think the first thing that we really have learned with the Vote Coalition the past couple of years is that the messenger matters. So all of our social media, every campus, they have an Instagram account. Different colleges have their own. Different centers within the campus have their own, right? So there's a ton of our institutions existing online. And there's so much noise on our phones, right? Like everyone's constantly getting bombarded with messages and infographics. Everything's happening on social media. So in that world, like students are a lot more likely to interact with a familiar face and fellow students. So we really have tried with our social media to really feature the voices of like the students and communities that we were partnering with. And even creating engaging content featuring students that are volunteering to register voters, because again, like they're a lot more likely to do it if it's naturally being distributed through like people resharing it because they saw their friend in this little promo for an event we're doing. And I think that's been incredibly helpful. I think the other point is, situating youth digital engagement is that it really is an opportunity and an asset for campuses when done correctly. And particularly, we see it as like an opportunity for connection and state-free expression online. And by really connecting our students with the work that is being done around our democracy in fun ways. Again, touching back to like civic joy, like, how can we foster that enthusiasm through making like fun content? But I think like one thing is like you don't have to worry too much about like losing like the importance of civics by making the content a bit more engaging. Everyone can put up an infographic with a QR code to register to vote, but you're a lot more likely to get people to engage with it if it actually has a human being talking to you, especially one that your students might know. And then yeah, like where do you go from there, especially when you're like trying to build these connections across campus? And I think like again, like the framing and the face of your content really makes a difference. And I mean, like on campus, we coordinate campus-wide emails from our chancellor that remind people to register to vote and remind them to turn out to vote. And that's, I think super helpful, especially when we're, talking about, the reach of getting into every student and staff's inbox. But also, most students have never met the chancellor. They've never interacted with the chancellor. So what other ways can we connect students with people that they actually like relate to, whether that's through their clubs, their faith-based groups, affinity and identity groups, rec spaces, etc., and really allow the message about voter registration, voter turnout, etc., to be distributed from the bottom up rather than just the top down, as is often the case. Because really, like at the end of the day, civics in our democracy is incredibly personal, right? Like it is a decision about whether to engage or disengage, who to vote for, how you want to engage outside of voting. So really like, taking that approach of, not just a one size fits all framing, but really that, if we want to engage in this democracy, that you really have to, advocate for what, being involved in civics can do for an individual and their community, rather than just, about a, civic duty or responsibility. Because that's really how we get, students and I think, most people in general to actually engage in the incredible work that everyone is doing on this call across the country. So with that, that is all of our content, all of our info about cultivating civic joy and responsibility in higher education. I want to thank you all so much for coming and open up to any questions, anything that Sandra and I could help y'all with. We are here for. And feel free to drop something in the chat, come off mute. Really happy to be a resource.
I'd love to ask a question. Where are people coming from? Like if you want to pop in your home campus into the chat, that'd be really interesting to see. And then what do you think is the best opportunity before you about cultivating civic joy? Like what's something you like to bring to your campus? ASU, I used to live in Arizona.
And I think, Sandra, your question is great because, each one of us bring, a different, experience and, whether it's our communities or just like what has worked on our campuses before. So yeah, I would definitely love to see y'all either out loud or in the chat engaging of like what y'all have done or seen that has worked in terms of really cultivating that civic joy, or even like a personal experience you've had of a time that you actually have been excited about our democracy and the work that everyone on this call is doing. So we have one in the chat from Roland from the University of Alabama. It said, when cultivating civic joy, I like to try and make voting seem like a fun thing you can do with your friends and bonding. Our friends don't let friends miss election stickers from AGF were a big hit. Yes. And I definitely think like that is such an important part of really looking towards like these like community bonds and friendships that are play a large role in connecting younger people and people in general to democracy is text a friend like and I think a lot of campuses do that where it's like bring your friend to the polls like it's really about that building of community that's so important. um and I see Grant dropped in the chat. We did a poll/voting simulation that got a lot of engagement. That is awesome. I think that
Well,
definitely,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry. I was going to add, what he didn't tell you is our candidates were Barbie and Ken. So it was around the time of the movie and our ambassadors all dressed up. And so it did get a lot of engagement, but that I think that made a difference.
awesome. And I love that, like, the ability to connect something, like a fake poll election kind of scenario with something that we know was very culturally relevant. And obviously from the sounds of it, seems like it really worked at engaging students with it. So that's awesome. I also see Tiffany dropped in the chat that we created really cool swag, and the students tend to engage more when they get a t-shirt, tumbler bottle, or tote bag for the events they attend, also doing our best to make the event fun and infuse games and music into the experience 100%. I cannot tell you the like number of t-shirts and like random swag that I collected by the time I graduated. And like having to like take that all home and like look through all the memories from all these different events and stuff. Definitely like three things, whether it's you know a t-shirt, it's food, it's the experience of, as you said, like music or games or whatever it may be. Definitely is like such a big difference in how we engage with one another, and like how we engage with our democracy. So that's awesome. Definitely loving all of your guys's 5 minutes left. With our last 5 minutes, definitely, if anyone else wants to drop in the chat your experiences with Civic Joy, or also feel free to, come off mute and share out with everyone. And also happy to take any questions. Crickets. Oh, geez. I mean, also would love maybe Deborah and Deborah and Grant, if either of you want to share a little bit more about this, voting simulation that y'all mentioned. It seems like a super cool program. That is awesome. Oh. Let me stop sharing.
Oh, come off mute, Deborah, so we can hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, we couldn't do Barbie versus Ken really officially because of the trademark or whatever, but but it was pretty clear. It was Barbara versus Kenneth. And it was on election day because we didn't have a local election last year. And so we partnered with an external organization. Grant helped set that up. Grant, if you want to talk, you can talk. I don't want to steal the spotlight. I just happen to have the poster, so I figured I'd show you that. If I could show you the pictures, they're great because we all dressed up, and Grant was amazing. He was Ken. Actually, we had two Kens and two Barbies. But it got a lot of students involved, and just talking about the voting process, and then they actually got to vote. I don't remember who won. Grant, who won?
I was going to say who won.
I don't remember. Grant, do you remember? I'm pretty sure it was Barbie.
Oh, that is incredible. It
was kind
of, you might have been a bit biased, but I definitely believe in you. But that is so awesome. And Sandra.
No, I just say that's so creative. It's wonderful.
Yeah, and I think I love this idea of like, how it's not just like, the students doing an event like this by themselves, but working with outside partners, working with people like the Interdriven Foundation, and like campus support too is so helpful. And I think like even just like the way that obviously like everyone is like super excited about getting to vote for Barbie or Ken, like that's like such a great way of really being able to engage with stuff that is a lot less stressful than our actual politics. Because I think it goes without saying, like so much of our politics right now is this is the most important election of our lives, every single election. And being able to bring students into the space and allow them to have that comfort of learning more about the process and feeling a bit more versed in our democracy without the additional layers of will my rights be taken away, am I going to be comfortable having existing in whatever new elected officials are in office, and being able to have a more lighthearted take on democracy is so cool to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have this dream, I'm just going to put it out there, see if it will come to realization, of creating I don't know if you guys saw this in 2020, but there was Joy to the Polls, Cha-Cha to the Polls in Philadelphia. So I have this dream of recreating that as Berkeley campus. So let's see if we can make it happen. I'm going to put this link in the chat.
That would be so cool. So, okay, well, it looks like we are at time. So just want to say massive thank you to all of you for coming to our session and joining us in talking all about civic joy and responsibility in higher education. We had such a great time chatting with y'all and always happy to answer any questions or talk more other times too.